This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Go to patreon.com/trifles to learn more.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 359, Dr. Watson's Secret. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you going to be secretive with me today?
Yes, I have my decoder ring. It's set for 14, and today's message is 8394CDZWY.
Be sure to drink your Ovaltine?
No.
Crummy commercial.
No, it's be sure to drink your because I really can't do codes very well.
Well, let's decode this episode for people then. This is our monthly feature where we look into some of the masterful essays done over the years. We call this series Master's Class, and this is the second in 3 episodes that we're doing on Christopher Morley. You can go back and check all of our archives this season for the monthly Master's Class, where we talked about Trevor Hall and Michael Harrison and Edgar W. Smith, and now we're into Christopher Morley. And this is also the penultimate Master's Class for Season 7 here, as December will mark our final one. So, the show notes for this episode are available at our website, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. That's where you can find links. You can sign up for email updates from us there to be notified when new episodes are out. Of course, you can also subscribe to us on any podcast platform you happen to listen to us on. You can even listen to us on your favorite smart speaker. Just ask them to post or to play the latest episode of Sherlock Holmes Trifles. And of course, you can support us on Patreon. There's a Patreon button there on our website, or you can just go to patreon.com/trifles. All of our Patreon supporters can listen to the show ad-free, and most importantly, at the end of every month and at the end of every quarter, we do drawings that are exclusive to our Patreon supporters. The monthly drawing gives you a chance to win a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and the quarterly one, a free annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So make sure you get on that. Okay, we are looking at Christopher Morley's essay, Dr. Watson's Secret. We're reading it from the book, The Standard Doyle Company, Christopher Morley on Sherlock Holmes, which was edited by Stephen Rothman, and it was published by the Fordham University Press. This essay in particular originally appeared in the Saturday Review of Literature and Morley's Bowling Green column from December 15th, 1934, 89 years ago. Wow. And it doesn't look a day over 50.
Doesn't look a day over 90. It's a wonderful example of Sherlockian scholarship, and it tells you a lot about Christopher Morley right at the beginning. Many people who follow commentaries and things related to the Sherlockian world may say to themselves, or may have the opinion, that Morley never delved much into chronology. Chronology tends to be one of these topics that's really resonant to a good subsection of Sherlockians, but there are also many Sherlockians who just don't want to be bothered. They just want to read the stories and enjoy them and not worry about what sequence actually one adventure followed the other. And you would have thought perhaps that this never occupied the mind of Morley, but no, not so. So in Dr. Watson's Secret, he gets right into it, and there's a couple of wonderful things you can learn immediately about Morley from these first sentences. He begins by saying, I spoke a while ago about a secret pertaining to Sherlock Holmes' life, and that was, of course, his American connection. But perhaps there's another secret, Dr. Watson's clandestine marriage. And then he gets right to this lovely sentence. He says, the infuriating inconsistencies of Watsonian chronology have cost scholars many a megrim. Now, megrim, it's not migraine, it's megrim. And megrim, some of you might say to yourself, that is a fish. The megrim or megrim sole or Cornish sole is a flatfish. No. It's also a very archaic word meaning depression or low spirits. And this is just vintage Morley. He delighted in finding and using these old words.
Well, it's also an old-fashioned. It's also an old-fashioned term for migraine, which is
megrim,
which is what he might mean. Cause people many a headache.
Yeah. Well, it is this archaic terminology, and he says, the more carefully we examine them, the more deeply confused they seem. Well, he gives us a little summary of the different dabblings in chronology, and then gets to the heart of his matter. He has some illustrations here. He says the case of the noble bachelor, dated by the hotel bill, is October 1887, and Watson in that case says this is a few weeks before my own marriage. And then in the stockbroker's clerk, there's some facts in there that also imply the wedding took place late in the year. And on the other hand, Morley says the crooked man and the naval treaty distinctly suggest that Watson's marriage was in the spring or early summer. So, how much of this can you dismiss by Watson being muddled? Perhaps he wove a tangled web in his chronology because he was deliberately trying to deceive.
Yeah, I like that subtle Shakespeare reference there. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Morley does a fine job in this setup of mentioning others who have attempted to account for some of Watson's inaccuracies or inconsistencies in the chronology. This is just, again, part of the setup where Morley is looking to eliminate all objections to his argument here, saying some authorities, e.g. Miss Dorothy Sayers, have attempted to account for slips on the theory that Watson misread his own handwriting. And others, e.g. Mr. S.C. Roberts, have fallen back upon the regrettable hypothesis that occasionally the doctor was not, quote, in his normal businesslike condition, end quote. So he kind of dismisses those out of hand, and what he does here is he weaves the hypothesis here that, as you say, Watson was deliberately trying to deceive us. He was trying to cover up this clandestine marriage, and I didn't realize that Mary Morstan was of clandestine derivative. I didn't realize they would have a clandestine marriage. Is that where you serve the cake before? I'm not familiar with their customs.
No, it's only because she went to the Church of the Clandestines. And that was a Scottish group, a clan of
Yes. It's all destiny with them.
Yeah,
with clan destinies. Yeah.
Hootman, now you've got it. Well, it becomes really delightful. Morley tells us, what about the year 1887? It's a really crucial year. There were so many important cases. The business of the Netherlands Sumatra Company, which took Holmes abroad. How and where Watson first met Mary Morstan, we don't know. It was probably, he says, in connection with the earlier case, when Holmes was of some slight service to her employer, Mrs. Cecil Forrester. Morley says, as an aside, I like to think, incidentally, that Mrs. Forrester's tranquil English home, with the stained glass in the front door, the barometer, and the bright stair rods, was in Natchbull Road, Camberwell, for which Bosico named the villain in After Dark, and he's referring to a great playwright. At any rate, he says, both Watson and Miss Morstan were lonely and financially insecure, and their romance was immediate, but both were afraid to admit it to their associates because Miss Morstan would lose her position and Watson would incur the annoyance of the misogynistic Sherlock.
Well, that puts them in quite a bind, certainly. And he says, in being as brief as possible, he says, let's re-examine the chronology of the year 1887. And he dismisses S.C. Roberts' conclusion that the sign of the four belongs to 1886, and then he kind of works his way back from the number of pearls that Mary Morstan received annually, which she says was about 6 years ago, beginning in May 1882. In reality, it was just over 5 years, but she thought of it as 6 because she had that number of pearls. And she said her father disappeared in December 1878, nearly 10 years ago. So from the beginning of 87, her grieving heart would naturally think of the bereavement as in its 10th year. So he very clearly makes a case for 1887 here, which is not out of question. And he says, I accept July 1887 as the date of the sign of the four, preferring to follow the postmark on Sholto's letter rather than Watson's subsequent reference to, quote, a September evening. So there are internal references that allow him to clearly indicate that the year is 1887 when the sign of four is happening.
And now he fills in so many lovely details. He says, well, what about the yellow fog? Rare in July, surely. Well, that was at least 7% cocaine. But mark well, we have here for the first time an explanation of Watson's mysterious telegram that morning. He and Mary Morstan Watson, weary of meeting by stealth, had at last decided to break their news to Sherlock Holmes. The mystery of the pearls, which they had so often discussed, was an additional motive. Watson had gone to the Wigmore Street post office. As a matter of fact, isn't it just around the corner in Wimpole Street? Not primarily to send a wire, but to receive one. Addressed poste restante was a message from Mary. She'd received the puzzling letter from Thaddeus Sholto and appealed to her husband for advice, and he wired back, telling her to come to Baker Street. And the bone for lunch, the wine for lunch, the bone for lunch, was his attempt to fortify himself for the revelation to come. Observe throughout the narrative how the sly old Watson kept the fact from Sherlock that he and Mary were already intimate.
Well, Watson's doing a pretty good job so far of keeping this marriage covered up from Sherlock Holmes. Well, let's uncover the rest of the facts here about 1887 and beyond right after this quick word. In 2023, the BSI Press has added more titles to its roster that you won't want to miss. First up this year is the latest in the BSI manuscript series, a title that takes you, well, maybe a moment to connect to the story, The Haven Horror. If you guessed The Adventure of the Retired Colorman, you're more clever than Josiah Amberley. This manuscript, once owned by Dame Jean Conan Doyle and bequeathed to the British Museum, is a very clean one, coming as it did at the conclusion of the canon. But the essays that accompany it are wonderfully informative. Dan Andriaco looks at prostheses in the canon. The BSI's resident toxicologist, Marina Stayich, brings us into the realm of poisons. And our own Bert Wolder tells about the life of the artist Frank Wiles. These and more are colorful, just as colorful as the original story that acted as a metaphor and reality, and it treats the reader to a kaleidoscope of shades and hues that will provide hours of reading pleasure. Be sure to get your copy of The Haven Horror before it's sold out at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. So we were with Watson and Mary as he enticed her to come to Baker Street, and Morley says, recapitulate then the events of 1887. Early in the year, probably February or March, while Holmes was absent in the Netherlands Sumatra business, Watson and Mary Morstan were secretly married. And they met when and how they could, but told no one. Their anxious and surreptitious bliss was interrupted by the news in April that Holmes was ill in Lyon. So Watson hurried to France. He and Sherlock returned together, and they spent April 25th through 27th at Reigate for the Reigate puzzle with Reigate Squire. And this was followed by the Grice Pattersons in the island of Ufa. And where is Ufa, by the way? Morley wonders. But if it is, as it sounds, in the Hebrides, Shetlands, or Orkneys, the Grice Pattersons would have sense enough not to go there until the midsummer. So, and then he goes on to say Holmes was in good spirits after the Reigate visit. Watson was gloomy because his secret preyed on his mind. He wrote many letters to Mary, and it was at the time of the Jubilee. That's, of course, when Holmes shot the VR into the wall, finally convinced Watson that he must make a break. With me, there's a limit, he said in the Musgrave Ritual, and he made his mind up to take charge of his own checkbook, find a home, and resume practice. So then the sign of 4 coming, as it did, in July, was a happy coincidence. And his anxieties about Miss Morstan becoming heiress of the Agra treasure were just as sincere as if he had really been only a suitor. And since their marriage had been concealed, everyone would be sure to think him a fortune hunter.
Well, once the excitement of the case was over, the pair went through the appearance of a formal engagement for the benefit of Holmes and Mrs. Forrester, not to say not for the benefit of Mrs. Hudson, too. And may it not have been Watson's now frequent visits to Natchbull Road that brought the Camberwell poisoning to Holmes's attention? No doubt soon after sign of 4, Mary had her summer vacation, and she and the doctor used this for a furtive honeymoon, perhaps in the glades of the New Forest, because Southsea would have been a little too public. So, when the elated husband narrating the 5 orange pips speaks of his wife, he forgets that she was not at that time known as such. It was not until November that he found a home of his own, left Baker Street, and set up housekeeping in Paddington. They simply told their friends around Guy Fawkes Day that they were going to slip off quietly to a registry office, and probably the medical practice was bought as of January 1st, 1888.
And Morley goes on. He says, sitting in a pile of cushions with plenty of shag tobacco and following the master's cardinal principle, the proceeding seems to me the only possible solution. This chronology harmonizes many apparently conflicting statements. It makes intelligible the allusions at the beginning of a scandal in Bohemia, which took place in March of 1888. It gives sense to Watson's eagerness that Sherlock Holmes should become interested in Violet Hunter. How delightful, the doctor thought naively, if he and Holmes should both marry governesses and the alumni of the same agency, for undoubtedly Mary, too, had been a client of Westaway's. When the stockbroker's clerk came along in June of 1888, Watson jumped at the chance to go to Birmingham with Holmes. He thought it might be able to persuade Sherlock to run out to Walsall, only 8 miles away, to see Miss Hunter at the school where she was headmistress.
And then, like a string of dominoes, Morley rearranges the rest of the canon to fit this chronology. He talks about the second stain and the case mentioned called the tired captain that we never learn about. The case of identity, says Morley, is evidently late spring of 1888, and the crooked man is the summer of 1888. Myself, I placed the engineer's thumb in 1888, not long after my marriage, Watson says. Even though Watson assigns it to the summer of 89, the Valley of Fear must have been in January 1889, followed by The Man with the Twisted Lip, and that autumn by The Hound of the Baskervilles. And then 1890 closes with The Red-Headed League and The Blue Carbuncle, etc., etc. It's pleasant, he says, to think of Holmes and Watson sitting down cheerfully to the post-Christmas goose, their last intimacy, before the tragic events of April and May 1891.
Yeah.
And it's also possible that Watson's innocent and timid subterfuge of this secret marriage quite escaped Holmes's attention, because he'd grown into the habit of regarding Watson as a lay figure who would never do the unexpected.
Yeah, and of course, during this time, Holmes would have been so intensely absorbed, Morley writes, in his own ideas, and except on those mischievous occasions when he turned the full focus of his observation on his companion, he was not likely to speculate much on Watson's private thoughts. And a man of Watson's upright, simple, and candid nature, once driven in upon himself, can develop surprising foxiness. It pleases me to think that the self-sacrificing doctor was dashing enough to seize the romance that came his way. His pangs, his honorable yearnings, his necessities for concealment gave him, every student has noticed, a special tenderness for women in distress. In brooding the problem of his later marriage, one could be tempted to wish the superb Grace Dunbar of Thor Bridge might have been the second Mrs. Watson. She had also been a governess, but knowing Senator Neil Gibson, that's unlikely.
Well, and that gets us to the capper that Morley uses to end all this. He says, having caused endless embarrassment by his transparent attempts to disguise the facts of his first marriage, no wonder Watson said nothing whatever about the second.
Well, I think this particular piece of scholarship would pair well with episode 318 from earlier this year. It would have been back in February, where we celebrated Wedding Month with an episode called Dr. Watson's Marriages. It might be interesting if listeners wanted to go back and take a listen to that again and compare it to Morley's masterful essay here, because self-contained, I think Morley makes quite a convincing argument, even though he's had to shuffle a few things around on the chessboard to his liking. But there were some wild assertions in episode 318 as well, as we looked at some of the scholarship around Dr. Watson's marriages.
Well, what's very clever about all this, among the many things, the usage of language, the dealing with chronology, the reshuffling of the canon, the fun Morley has with this, is that he had the imagination to look at some of the inconsistencies around dates and times and say to himself, completely out of the blue, what would have happened if, in fact, Watson was married secretly earlier? And it's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. a very attractive woman.
Was she? I hadn't noticed.